In this last video, I want to go over how some of the numbers for these divs were calculated. I picked 600 as a width for my container, and that is just because that's a good standard size. Text should never be in a block more than 600. In fact, even 600 pixels wide of text is a little bit hard to read. So I'm putting it into something that's 600 and then with a padding so it makes it a little bit smaller. But my div over here with an ID of main, the number wasn't random. I gave it a width of 480, and I want to go over how I came up with that number. I came up with that number because I knew that my images, I was going to put 3 in a row, and each image had a width of 150 pixels. So if I add those together, that makes 450. I knew that I wanted to have a certain amount of space in between my images, and that a padding of 5 pixels would work. So to calculate that, I'm going to add 5 pixels for my ends, but what happens in the middle is that I get 5 pixels for each side, so it's actually 10 pixels. So adding up my two ends, it becomes 460. Adding this one middle here, it becomes 470. Adding this other middle here, it becomes 480. So that's how I came up with the number of 480 pixels. Just so we can see what happens if I changed it to 500, it's not going to be perfectly centered, and I would need to make some other adjustments. Probably I would add some more padding. I would calculate up. Okay, I'm going to undo that. The other thing is, let's talk about the header here for a second. Now, I had pointed out that I was looking at an old worksheet that had given you specific dimensions for the width, which was 490, and then I had corrected on the worksheet because you don't really want to put in a specific dimension for one of these divs if you wanted to just take on the full dimensions of the container div that it's in. So I had put in 490, and it has a padding of 5 pixels, and it's working because 5 pixels here, 5 pixels here equals 600, which was the width of our container. If I had put in a padding of 15, I'm going to change that and look outside, you can see that my header is now larger than the container. So if I wanted to have a padding of 15 and I wanted to put in the specific number of my header, the specific width, I would have to reduce the size of the width. Or the other thing is I could simply take out the dimensions for the width, and the width of my header will now just become whatever the width of the container is, and now I can apply my 15 pixels of padding inside. The last thing is just to point out what that margin did for the heading. So I put a margin of 20, and that's what gives the little buffer zone here. If I take that out, you can see that now my my main div goes right after the header div. I'm going to undo that. The last thing I want to talk about is the difference between the kind of divs that we're doing here, which are all relative, and the divs that are talked about in the second part of the chapter in your book, which are AP divs. So if I save this page, well, before I save it, I'm going to put in a title here because untitled document is not very nice. So I'm just going to call this Troy, save it, and preview. So it's relative, meaning it is always going to be auto-centered to the middle, regardless of whatever size I have my page. So as I make my page smaller, my content moves with it. Okay, now let's go back to Dreamweaver, and I'm going to insert layout object, but this time an AP div. So this is what you're doing in the book with the, I think it's the flower or horticulture type of website that they have you go through, and you're using AP divs and they actually have you draw them. So an AP div, if you insert it like this, or if you draw it, it's just going to go onto your page, and you can click it and move it around. So quite unlike these other divs that we're putting in. To give it an ID, I would just go down here to my property inspector, so I'll just call this image. Now I could start writing rules for any div that has the ID of image, just like I did for my ones over here. And I'll just put an image into this so we can compare the difference. So I'm going to save it. And we'll preview. And so here it is. And now watch what happens when I shrink down my window. The AP div, although it's very easy to put down onto your screen and to change the size of it, but it's stuck in that position. It's fixed. It doesn't move. So notice how my other divs are moving and that one stays frozen. That might be an effect that you want at times, but it also can cause a lot of problems in your layout. So it's just something you should be aware of.